The Rachel Maddow show starts right now. I won't miss it. Even though there's a football game on, I won't miss the next hour. Rachel, good evening.
Football? Is that a dog barking in the distance? What is this football? Thank you, Ed. Appreciate it, man. Thanks to you at home for staying with us for the next hour as well. When President Obama presented his American Jobs Act to the country in September, Congress reacted with all the urgency of a sleepy puppy lying in a sunbeam on a soft pillow. Some of the American people, however, took a slightly more active approach. In Houston, a group of demonstrators gathered at a federal building to say to the world that they wanted an economy that works for everyone. They were angry, they said, that their Republican senators voted against the American Jobs Act. 8 people were arrested. In Miami, protesters gathered at a congressman's office demanding that he support the American Jobs Act. In Bucks County, Pennsylvania, again, same thing. Local residents went to their congressman's office to vent their anger about a vote against the American Jobs Act. Those demonstrations were all roughly around that specific piece of legislation, but they were framed, of course, to make a more basic and broader point. The point that we as a country ought to be doing public investment. We ought to be dealing with our infrastructure. We ought to be building and repairing and reinforcing our way out of our economic mess. We ought to be spending on roads and bridges. It's something that everyone would benefit from. And in conjunction with the president making a pitch for that politically, there were some public demonstrations around the country. After the president's big pitch for his Jobs Act to a joint session of Congress, you may also remember that the president went to the Brent Spence Bridge in Ohio, right near the Kentucky border. So he was in the home state of Republican Speaker of the House John Boehner. He was in Ohio, and he was in sight of the home state of Republican Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. So President Obama went to the bridge that straddles the home states of the 2 most powerful Republicans in Congress and said if Congress passed the bill, the American Jobs Act would replace that bridge and other structurally deficient bridges like it across the country. One such structurally deficient bridge is the Charlestown Bridge in Boston, where protesters tried and failed last month to march. They did march to the bridge, but they failed to march on it.
And you're looking live again from Sky 5 at the Charlestown Bridge. There is a bit of a standoff with police not allowing anybody on the bridge. And part of the reason why they wanted to go to that bridge is that many of the union protesters who are joining them at this hour believe if we repaired bridges like that one, there would be more jobs.
The Boston Globe reported that week that the protesters had wanted to hang a sign on the Charlestown Bridge that said, "Fix this bridge, create jobs now." If you actually look here at that local footage, you can actually see the big "Fix This Bridge" banner that they wanted to, there it is, that they wanted to hang up there. But like I said, the protesters and their banner failed to march on to the bridge because, according to the Boston Herald at the time, police told protesters that the aging structure, the bridge, would buckle if they all walked onto it. Point made, right? Marching onto the decrepit bridge to point out how decrepit it is too dangerous because the bridge is so decrepit it might not support the protesters' weight. That scene on the Charlestown Bridge was last month. Today, in dozens of cities across the country, protesters were back at their local structurally deficient and otherwise bridges, making essentially the same argument: fix, rebuild, invest, and refurbish this country back into prosperity, enact public policy that benefits the many and not just the rich few. Spend on infrastructure to put people to work building it, and so we can all benefit from it economically and otherwise. And in the context of this Occupy Wall Street movement, this leaderless, insistent, apparently resilient movement, the emphasis on public investment is now part of a larger idea, larger conversation about reconfiguring our economy and our political system so it might serve people beyond just the richest Americans. It was a key moment for the nationwide Occupy Wall Street movement overall when protesters attempted to march across the Brooklyn Bridge for the first time last month. 700 people were arrested that day. 700. Those arrests did not slow down the very young movement at that point. They, in fact, seemed to accelerate it. Police action against these demonstrations, broadly speaking, does appear to be fortifying the protesters' resolve over these last 6 weeks. Monday night into Tuesday morning of this week, New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg ordered the Occupy Wall Street protesters out of their encampment spot at Zuccotti Park in Lower Manhattan. Law enforcement destroyed tents and cleared out the encampment. Following that crackdown, today was a day of action in New York City that's bigger than anything else Occupy Wall Street has done. Protesters staged a sit-in again at the Brooklyn Bridge. Here's what you just saw there was them projecting 99% onto buildings in downtown Manhattan. They clashed with police at Zuccotti Park, the base camp of Occupy Wall Street, where police had executed Mayor Bloomberg's eviction orders earlier this week. There were reports of violence from Lower Manhattan today. One police officer reportedly suffered a laceration on his hand after someone threw something that was made of glass at him. There were disturbing images today of a bloodied protester, reportedly bloodied by police at Zuccotti Park. The New York Times reporting this evening that more than 200 people were arrested in New York City today. 5 people charged with felony assault, 7 officers and 10 protesters reported to be injured. One of the people arrested was, interestingly, a retired Philadelphia police captain named Ray Lewis, leading to this striking photograph. One of the other largest protests today was in Los Angeles, in that city's financial district. Protesters marched to the 4th Street Bridge in L.A. It spans the Los Angeles River. It was built 80 years ago, that bridge was. 24 protesters in Los Angeles were arrested. Even as the context feels different, and the relationship between people protesting in the streets and police in the streets feels different over time, and it has a much different history now for this protest movement than it did even a couple of months ago. What still stands in the middle of this conversation are these bridges, including that Charlestown Bridge where protesters marched to but not on last month. Protesters were back today, at least near the Charlestown Bridge. According to organizers, quote, they planned it this way. Protesters will only march to the base of this bridge because it is so structurally unsound. Rivets on it haven't been used since the 1930s. So that's what happened in the country today, in the streets today, in the cities today. In Washington, D.C. today, what happened is that Republicans declared victory on the issue of infrastructure. Republicans in Congress declared that they got what they wanted. They are celebrating that they think they have brought down the administration's plans to invest in high-speed rail, like what China already has tons of. There's a big victory today for the Republicans in Washington. Woohoo! No trains! We won! Now everything's going to be awesome. The Occupy Wall Street protests are not particularly oriented toward electoral politics, at least not yet. This is not being run by some political consultant, right? They're not gearing up to be running candidates in the primaries at this point. This does not seem to be that type of transactional movement at this point. If you're a person who's interested in American politics of all kinds, we're sort of left now to trying to understand these parallel tracks. Not train tracks. No, we're having no trains. They're not train tracks, but they are parallel. There is this rather unruly, ungoverned, almost protean expression of disgust and desire for change that's being expressed in the streets all across the country. And then there's the other track that is seeming to be in parallel with it. The big Washington celebration today of the big, beautiful political power of doing nothing, of stopping something from getting built. These are the two tracks at which people are expressing their political will right now in the United States. When will these two parts of American politics stop running parallel to one another and start either running in conflict or at least talking to each other? Or are they already? Joining us now is Melissa Harris-Perry, professor of political science at Tulane University and an MSNBC contributor. Melissa, thanks for being here tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. Good to be here.
Do we have totally separate political tracks in this country right now, the sort of governing and electoral politics track and what's happening in the streets? Or do you see these things speaking to each other yet?
Well, they are, and it's always bridges, right? As you were introing and thinking about bridges, I keep thinking about the fact that it's the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which is the moment, the turning point moment in the civil rights movement, where finally you get a majority of the country on the side of civil rights protesters, because as they're coming across that bridge, they're turned back by the violence of local police. Now, in this case, what's been happening is that the occupiers are connecting with these local municipalities, with the mayors or with the police officers. And as fraught as that has been, as much as that has energized the movement and I think gotten even more people on the side of occupiers, it doesn't address this, as you say, parallel track. Those local officials are under some of the same constraints that the 99% are. They are trying to deliver more and more services with fewer and fewer resources. And so that battle is insufficient. The real fight is this fight that is about whether or not we're going to actually govern in this country on behalf of the majority.
How does that happen, though? Either how does it happen historically? You're making the analogy with the civil rights movement. But I guess even if we can just try to understand it cognitively. How do you get from a fight that in the moment is sometimes a literal fight and is about the right to assemble, and it's about police behavior, and it's about right to free speech, and it's about people getting arrested and going to jail, and that becomes this immediate concern? How does that translate to larger support or larger rejection of the broader thing that those people were assembling for in the first place?
Well, so here's my hope. I'm hoping that what Occupy has done here is to actually collectively bring together a set of ideas that already existed but didn't have an institutional or movement popular base. So when you look at the past 50 years in kind of American political thought, it is conservative dominated. And I don't just mean the GOP, but I mean the notion that the market is the very first place where we should always look for an answer. And this, in fact, comes from a set of institutions, think tanks, conservative universities, philosophers who are writing about this, who are implementing it globally, actually, this kind of market-based individual analysis that whenever it sees inequality, it asks one question: what's wrong with poor people? Why are poor people poor? And what we see here is, for the first time, a mass-based movement that brings together a set of progressive ideas that has been asking the question, when they see inequality, how did rich people get rich? Why are these rich people rich? This can't all be merit. These people can't be that much more meritorious than poor people. And that's a shift of the question. And if what they're doing is collecting on something that exists in these institutions, then maybe it lights the fire under the institutions to do the kind of insider work.
If that shift in dynamics that we're talking about, the unnatural thing being the 1% having such a concentration of wealth and power in this country, rather than the unnatural thing being the rest of the country not having it, what does it matter, and how does it matter if Zuccotti Park is never overnight occupied again? If these people lose their physical space that they have been occupying? They haven't just been marching and rallying. They have been willing themselves to stay out overnight in uncomfortable circumstances and take up space. What happens if they lose those spaces?
Yeah, I'm not convinced that this is the worst thing that can happen. I think it's bad, and I think it's particularly bad for our right to assemble, kind of constitutionally bad for us as a country. But I'm not certain that it's the worst thing that could happen to the movement, because there's a way in which it has become a bit of a tourist spot. Now, I don't mean for the occupiers themselves, but there's a way that once it becomes truly a almost permanent or semi-permanent residence, then it can lose some of its own kind of fire behind it. Today was in part emblazed by the having been pushed out. So
today became Occupy everywhere.
Yeah, I'm not prepared yet to write the requiem of the Occupy movement, even if they can't camp anymore.
I think the Occupy everywhere feeling of today, as this one was not only around the country, but even in New York City, around the city, I think was a important theoretical point for where this moves forward. But we're going to have to see. Melissa Harris-Perry, professor of political science at Tulane, MSNBC contributor. It's always nice to have you here. Thanks a lot, Melissa. All right. The Herman Cain as Performance Art Project analysis here continues. Just when you think his most prolific period as an artist is over, he tops himself. Same medium, different day. A curated tour of the Herman Cain Art Project's latest gallery installation is next.